Ahoy there! I previously made a video about how I turned a pre-built PC into a sick sleeper XP gaming PC. I've been enjoying it so much that I moved around things under my sleeping quarters to accommodate my old desk and a monitor. The CRT monitor is new to my setup, but I'm getting off track here. What I'm trying to get to is that I mentioned a failed first attempt at trying to turn a different pre-built into an XP gaming computer. I did almost zero research on this computer when trying to work on it, and I ran into a lot of headaches. But things are different now since I waited around a month to finally be able to restore this thing. So now we're going to take a look at this PC and see what it is or isn't capable of in 2023. This is an HP Pavilion a706n, one of two that I picked up for free at my local computer store. When I got this, it was in well-used condition with a typical 20-year-old dust that covered every inch inside and out. Same with the keyboard. There were actually two identical PCs sitting there unused and destined for the scrap heap. After my initial struggles getting this thing to work, I took home its twin brother to use for parts. And I mean use for parts. Like I said at the end of the first XP video, the motherboard had fallen victim to the capacitor plague, a period between the late 90s and mid-2000s where cheaper capacitors were used throughout many consumer electronics. They would fail during their service life or sometime after and would show symptoms like bulging or burst caps, as well as leaking. Because the caps on that PC went rogue, I wouldn't be firing that thing up again. And ever since my last video on XP computers, I've just been massing a graveyard of broken or old computers. Most of these are going to be useful for parts, but all of them are ready to log out for good. Like this, the Compact Presario model SR1010NX, a true budget computer of the time. This fossil came with an Intel Celeron CPU and not one, but two IDE hard drives. One was 40 gigabytes, like advertised on the front, and the other was 60 gigabytes. I powered it on and it did work, but one of the drives seemed to be bogged down. Either that or the Celeron inside is slow. It still had an XP installation on it, but I knew one way or another that it wasn't going to be powering on after that. Firstly, this computer also fell victim to the capacitor plague. Caps were bulging and or blown in spots similar to my other Pavilion. Secondly, it was so slow and filled with shovelware games. Now, I appreciate the guys at the local computer store making a major bullet point out of this, but they just weren't my kind of games. Think of things like game show games or hidden object games. Next, there's the aforementioned twin brother this computer came with. It was in worse shape with no power supply and the previously mentioned bad caps. It did, however, come with another part I would definitely be using, a 1GB RAM stick. Not something this computer came with, but I appreciate the upgrade. The lack of a power supply gives me a pretty good hunch as to why it's not there. Power supplies of the time were mostly bad, and they were also subject to the capacitor plague. Anytime I see a power supply that's gray instead of black, I'm instantly put on edge, since these things are ticking time bombs. Spending time working on this computer, I'm convinced it uses the same case design of the computer that belonged to my grandmother on my dad's side. Either this or the Media Center desktop they sold in the mid-2000s. It's definitely one of the two with its silver front and blue power button light, but my grandmother's PC was definitely a Media Center PC since it had the Royale theme and Windows Media Center installed. Regardless of whether or not it used this case design, I spent quite a long time playing shovelware games and demos on this as a kid, as well as some Flash games online, whenever my family went to visit her. After she passed away in 2016, me and my brother had one last go on the computer doing things online, even though you weren't supposed to since XP was no longer supported. It barely did any modern internet things at all since it had no dedicated graphics and it had a CPU that couldn't keep up with the internet today. After trying to fire up the computer one last time in hopes of taking it home and saving it, it would not power on. Nothing. Nothing I did would bring that poor PC back to life. Since I was much less knowledgeable in PC repair back in 2016, the computer and all its accessories were sent off for scrap. Kind of a shame, really. My grandmother ultimately took the computer with her to the grave. So I've got two computers that I used for parts, as well as a script I'd previously written when I was first working on this. I used to have a lot more footage for this project, but when I put it on the back burner, I deleted most of that footage to save space on my phone and my Google Drive. Saved a few clips and photos, though, and I used some of it in the XP build video. The media I had went over a couple of upgrades I'd put into the Pavilion, such as the GeForce 256 and the 1GB RAM stick, but since I didn't have any spinning rust and couldn't make use of my SATA hard drive from my first desktop, I paused this project. Well, I got drives now. I decided to put the 40GB drive in this, even though this machine came with a 160GB drive from the factory, which was removed for obvious security reasons. Despite having a quarter of the storage, older programs and games didn't take up that much space. That means it had plenty of space to install XP Service Pack 3. Oh, and the network card came out too, of course. It's not needed in this day and age. Using a USB drive I devoted to the task of installing XP from, I gave installation a shot and immediately had success, since it recognized the IDE hard drive straight away. No blue screens of death to be seen here. The motherboard has SATA ports on it, but I've had no luck getting SATA to work properly on either of these XP machines I've worked on. But despite being spinning rust, the lower quantity of storage made reformatting quicker, taking half an hour as opposed to the 4 hours to format a 1.5 terabyte hard drive. Installation finished without a hitch, and basic installation of XP was complete. SP3 apparently had all the drivers for the 256, but I was going to install the drivers for the card, and everything else for that matter. I was able to find the drivers I needed the most, but trying to install things from the disk drive was a failure. This drive, as well as the other one from my Pavilion's twin, was dead. Mechanically it worked, but it didn't recognize any disk I put into it. I retreated to the Presario for another part, its DVD drive. Putting it into the Pavilion showed that it worked, being recognized by the BIOS. But the damn tray door was stuck! That usually means the tray belt was stretched out after years of use. I decided to put my hands-on side to good use by swapping the belts between the two drives. I could have tried the boiling water method, but from what I heard, it's a 50-50 split of success or failure to shrink the belt. Swapping the belts worked, as the belt was tight enough to reliably open the tray. Well, at least for now. Who knows when that belt will wear out. So with the disk drive swapped and fixed, the Pavilion was restored. Well, mostly. I didn't have a restore disk from HP, but honestly those came with a lot of bloatware, which would make this 40GB drive a little more cramped. At least I could go find an archive of older HP wallpapers, which are oddly nostalgic to me. I spent a lot of time with HP machines during practically all my years in school. The desktops in my school district were all HP from Windows 98 to XP to 7 to 10. My middle school years were dominated by HP netbooks running Windows XP. They hardly played any kind of game, they were tiny, they ran hot, and they were hampered by web filters that blocked a lot of Flash game websites. But by high school, we'd moved on to iPads, but the desktops were still HPs, even though a Pentium 4 wasn't the best choice for Windows 7 or Windows 10. Netbooks were great for schoolwork until they weren't. The early 2010s were simpler times. Anyway, back to the PC. This Pavilion runs on an AMD Athlon XP 3000 Plus processor running at 2.1 GHz, with a total of 1.5 gigs of RAM thanks to that additional stick. The hard drive is 40 GB in size, and the video card is a GeForce 256 with 32 MB of VRAM running on the GP bus. The front of the case features the repaired DVD-ROM drive as well as a slide door that reveals a 3.5-inch floppy drive, a multi-card reader, 3 USB 2.0 ports, a FireWire port, and front panel audio. The motherboard is the polar opposite of the Lenovo I have. It's AGP and PCI only, as opposed to the Lenovo having PCIe only. That means sound cards and other expansions are possible. What isn't possible is running any mid-2000s PC game, let alone Doom 3 or Crysis. What I hope to use this machine for is late 90s PC gaming. A lot of games from that era can still run on 32-bit XP, and the 256 I found should be more than capable of running those games of old. It's not as good as the 3DFX Voodoo 4, mind you, but that card came out a year later in 2000. Most mid-2000s games required a minimum of 64 megabytes of VRAM, and Crysis, of course, required 4 times as much as that. I'm familiar with the infamous Doom 3 video, forcing Doom 3 to run on an old Voodoo card, but A, it's a much more terrifying game than the actual game, and B, the computer's going to protest the fact that it's running, or trying to run, this game at such a low spec. Gaming was likely not this computer's main purpose. It's just another one of those cheap computers meant for general use in a family. Nowadays, with the end of XP support in 2014 and most of these computers dying to neglect, internet stupidity, or blown capacitors, most people would see this computer and call it junk. Hell, this computer was on its way to being junked before I leaped on it. So I have an XP computer for the higher end games, and I'll be hoping to use this Pavilion to bridge the gap between 98, 2000, me, and XP. I won't be looking at any DOS games, since DOS doesn't exist in XP, so the floppy drive is best used for reading and writing files. The only game I have on hand to fulfill this purpose is Microsoft Combat Flight Simulator 2 from 2000. Oh, and I'll be borrowing this flight stick from my brother, one by Cytec, who's known for these kinds of input devices. Installing the drivers... Well, I didn't say it was a permanent solution. But like other disk drives getting stuck, you just need patience and a gentle nudge to get it working.
So now it works.
I got the joystick drivers installed, so now it's on to Combat Flight Simulator 2. I kinda dig the comic book style of the menus in the pilot's manual. The game runs just fine at 800 by 600, and the joystick worked like a charm. Now, I didn't know exactly what I was doing, as with most simulators, but everything on the joystick was mapped correctly. One of the buttons on top of the stick actually lights up. That's cool. Maybe I'll give this sim another go one day, and definitely with this flight stick. As for what XP came with, it unsurprisingly runs fine. Space Cadet is still Space Cadet, and Spider Solitaire is still Spider Solitaire. Really, the games built in the XP are all you need to kill an afternoon or get fired from your job. The whole initial build process was ultimately a failure, but it's better for me to see this as less of a failure and more of a learning experience. It taught me to do my research for the Lenovo, and that turned out way better of a sleeper than the Pavilion ever could be. It taught me to be resourceful and patient. It took me a month waiting to finish this project, and I was able to use multiple parts from different computers to maximize its potential and actually get it working. To paraphrase Thomas Edison, I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't make a gaming computer. As for my plans for this Pavilion, I'll just have to hunt for some of the older PC games out there like Unreal Tournament, Lego Island, and Half-Life, and the like. I'm sure those games might work on the Lenovo, but it'd feel more appropriate to the era to run those games on a machine that was actually made closer to those games' releases. But was this computer worth restoring? Despite the setbacks and lack of research, yes. In an objective sense, these machines aren't worth restoring in any way, but there's just something about its averageness that drew me to it. That and the fact it was free. Most people see computers like this Pavilion and call it junk, but with persistence, a little money, and some elbow grease, you'll have yourself a nice diamond in the rough.